Hello and welcome to the Human in the Machine podcast, the podcast about all things HCI. As always, I'm your host, Professor Ben Cowan. In this episode, I'm chatting to Professor Louis Chuang from Chemnitz University of Technology in Germany, based on his talk in part 1. Our conversation goes through talking about the role of psychological science in HCI, the use of psychological concepts, and the reflection of where we need to be to ensure human-technology partnership. Louis and I take some tangents in this chat, but I really feel this adds to the reflection on the subject in question. Remember, if you like the podcast, please review us and follow us. Also, please do get in contact with us, and thanks so much for people who have given us kind words about the podcast in person and via email. I'm glad you're liking the show. If you want to get in contact, you can by emailing us at humaninthemachinepodcast@gmail.com. Enough from me, here's my chat with Louis. Enjoy. First of all, Lewis, thanks so much for a really great talk, and one that goes across so many different views in the area, as well as touching on some of the really core questions, I think, of our time in HCI that are really important to reflect on. One of the questions I had initially is actually to try and kind of link it back to some of the talks that we've had over the previous weeks. You mentioned an awful lot about your background within psychology and your background, that you've presented here today. I just wanted to get a sense from you, first of all, how critical you feel psychological science more generally is to this aspect of designing effective technologies as tools, but also as partners.
I've taken an indulgence of going a few steps back, right? Since I have, ever since I found myself a permanent job, of just saying, well, rather where might we have gone wrong? Now, we have, perhaps as a result of historical reasons, try to deconstruct and reduce the human mind into pieces, as you've just mentioned, modules of working memory, executive function, long-term memory. So we've adopted an approach of functionalism, right? To think of these aspects as small boxes, as we might do when designing a computer, that have very specific and well-defined tasks, right? And the utility of that is that it allows us to come up with schemas, blueprints of how we might achieve a piece of work, right? Like I'm showing here in this diagram. We might say, well, in order to move a mouse from one side of the screen to the other, I need to engage my eyes. I need to think about what exactly it is that I'd like to capture. And then I might decide then to engage my hands. So I might be doing all of these different things across these different modules. And then we can start specifying how much time does it take to engage each one of these modules, right? But that may not entirely capture how things really are, because no given model or set of predefined boxes of functions by psychologists might adequately capture the human mind. And everyone agrees, we have working theories, we have working models, right? So in that sense, I don't think psychological scientists come up with these concepts or theories of working memory or long-term memory to serve as boxes for engineers to start doing software engineering or to define their software architecture, right? But engineers do that anyway, and they would gleefully cite, well, psychologists state that we have a box in the human mind that does X, whereas a psychologist would say, no, that's just a placeholder. That's just a label to describe the phenomena until we understand it better, right? But it's useful. It's useful. It captures average behavior it gives an indication, as you might in a computational model like this, the amount of time it takes to point at something, as well as the range of the time it takes to point at something. It allows engineers to deal with very practical problems. If I would like to save all this amount of time of pointing at something, what do? Well, I'll simply couple this point of reaching somewhere with this point instead. And look at that. I've just saved 800 milliseconds of time it takes to access something, right? Now, what engineers might not anticipate, which is why we will always be in business, right, are the new problems that occur, right? The potential for confusion, the amount of time it might take for something to be socially acceptable. And I don't think it frustrates those of us with a psychology or sociology background as much as it frustrates software engineers or people with computer science or engineering backgrounds who don't understand why humans don't behave the way the books specify that they ought to be behaving, right? So, I'm not too fussed about this because I never once said that here's a bit of a box of the eye that is guaranteed to move in 100 milliseconds. I'm saying that, here's my working definition of what an eye is. And if it so happens that new evidence appears that says that the eye is really just a bit of gel, to prevent people from seeing my brain, I'll accept it, right? So I think we're very comfortable with that. So I don't really know where I'm going with this. Right. The point is, happy to take the perspective of functionalism, but I'm perfectly happy in my own research to go, that's not the game we're playing, right? I want to describe the experience. I want to describe the phenomena. I want to uncover unexpected ways of behaving, of thinking, new psychological phenomena or concepts or theories that might emerge as a result of the appearance of new engineering, of new technology, right? I think that really defines, my interests. What I might contradict so-called traditional psychologists who want to treat all of this as a hard science is that I don't think anything that we do in psychology is really hard because they're concepts, they're fluid.
Yeah.
They're not as hard as the design of our brain, for example, or fingers on our hand. We're unlikely to develop a sixth finger overnight.
You touched on an interesting thing as well, where I think that there's that fluidity to, aspects of psychological science where or aspects of findings within the psychological discipline that I think you're right, that we realize that those are always going to be fluid. And that when you then have to make a hard applied decision based on how to identify, change an interface or how to build an interface to help with a particular psychological concept, there's sometimes a bit of a mismatch because of the
Right.
fact that there is that fluidity in understanding attention, for instance, or understanding how even new technologies might influence attention. I
Right.
think that as an interesting from a scientific point of view, I think that's a really interesting tension to have, and I think HCI might be one of those places where that occurs. Is that fair enough to say? Do you think?
Right. So I had previously suggested that psychology was, or rather cognitive psychology, was heavily influenced by computer science, or the early days of computer science, to go, aha, we know there's something between what we perceive or what we sense and how we act. We've always known that exists, cognition, right? Or mental acts, but we've never been able to kind of give it a language, right?
Yeah.
And computer science came along and went, well, in order to create something that's capable of computations, of calculations, you need something called working memory. You need something that stores information for long periods, right? So really, computer science gave cognitive psychology the language to work with, to start talking about, right, the brain. Now, HCI or human factors were given a language by, even before this period of time, behaviorists, physical, in Germany, mechanical engineering, to decompose work into units, functional units, in the very same way, right? So I'm really talking more about a culture than I'm talking about hard science, a culture of reductionism, a culture of unitization, right? If you know, in the act of making a shoe, right, all the different steps and all the sub-process and the sub-task, which is the pride of human factors, right? You can start unitizing it. You can say, I know you're not very good at making shoes, but you're absolutely smashing at cutting leather, right? I'm going to give you a job of only cutting leather and place you in this part of the assembly process, right? Hence the birth of the assembly lines, right? And human factors. Now we continue to think in the same way, right? And really what you're seeing here in the first and second industrial revolution is a massive computer, if you will, right, of an input material and output product, right? What you're really seeing here are many sub-processes that come together to bring together a final output or a final product. Now, but what's the danger here when we focus on the outcome given the inputs and lose sight of the whole process or the whole experience, right? Machines are oftentimes capable of, especially with manual processes and now increasingly sensing and thinking processes, capable of automizing things that we ourselves have the imagination of currently specifying and describing, right? So there is this fear that automation will take over humans and we'll all start to lose jobs, right? Karl Marx himself protested against factories, claiming that the production of way too many things results in useless people. What use do I have for someone who's only good at cutting leather, but incapable of producing an entire shoe, right? What use do I have for someone who's really good at stringing a rod, but incapable of the entire process of catching a fish, right? Now, I don't want to just criticize this reductionist way of thinking about technology and processes, right? Because technology has indeed, if we look at history, brought about great advantages to society. This fear of machines taking over our job has rather, if we look at recent history since the Industrial Revolution, it's reduced the number of meaningless work, right? Being in the fields. Agriculture was hit the hardest because we were able to produce loads without requiring the same amount of manual labor, resulting in large growth. And I'd like to point out education. It gave me a job and healthcare, right? It's also created, with increased variation in products, jobs in retail and trade. Now, some of these jobs are now being taken away, right? Especially in trade and retail, right? Through the automatization, we no longer need people to stand at a cashier machine, right? Rather, we might be seeing new jobs where bespoke pieces, people being free to actually create hand-woven design, textile design. Now, I'm not going to over-romanticize this. This is a very niche example, right? And technology also allows us to actually participate. I might never be any good at weaving, and never will be, but I could, if I deem fit, I now have access to actually learn it without seeking out a master weaver, right? So the question that you've asked, which I'm not really answering, is an issue of worth, right? What are we giving worth to, right? And that's a far deeper question that we ought to be asking ourselves. What's our sense of being, right? What gives us joy? What defines who we are, right? And as long as we continue to play this game of instrumentalism, of thinking in terms of function, in terms of thinking of worth as production, right? Then we're not going to escape this framing, this way of thinking about technology, right? So I'm currently focusing on ideas of how rather it could be empowering us, right? ways in which we could be designing technology to give to deliver potentially equity. Here's an example where many individuals with visual impairment, they're hanging on to their old devices with actual physical buttons and knobs instead of touch screens, because they simply cannot feel their ways around a flat touch screen, which looks really sleek, right? But they shouldn't have to do so, right? So can we combine things like computer vision to give them labels that they can actually see, because they're not blind, they can see colors, they can see squares, they can see stars, they can see very, very crude shapes, right? But they cannot read not just these small text on touch screen. They cannot get their head around either the fact that some of these buttons can change within seconds from one interface to a different one, right? So what we view as being adaptive might be viewed as being an absolute nuisance. So that's kind of where we're investing our efforts at the moment, to think about rather how technology can enable individuals to participate, to have equitable experiences in everyday life,
Well,
if they so intend. Yeah.
first of all, on the utilitarian aspects of that you
Mhm.
highlighted before, and as you know, as a person who, you admitted in your talk that is almost kind of, a form of conversion across us there. How do we stop thinking in those utilitarian terms, or in those tool-oriented terms? Because I was actually really taken in the talk about how that transformation of trying to move away from that. And I think that's a fundamental thing, especially with the aspects of collaborative AI, and the movement towards that element of human AI or human machine partnership. How do we get out of that thinking of utilitarianism, or that task-oriented nature that we're focusing on at present?
Right. Well, one way of thinking of it might be, first of all, to assign value or worth, not to results. I mean, sorry, that's not to say that you shouldn't all do really well in your exams, right? um, but to enable experiences, right? So on the one hand, if we stuck with the old ways, my daughter, for example, would never be able to repair her pram, right? But because someone has engineered to say, well, it's an absolute nuisance to have to keep turning a screwdriver, such that, now all that one needs to do is to push to screw something, right? My daughter can now participate in the experience of actually repairing her own door pram, right? I think we need to think of experiences and enabling individuals who might not otherwise yet have the ability to achieve these experiences, to enable them to have such experiences, as well as to critically question if this new experience is qualitatively better beyond performance, right? So beyond performance, is it qualitatively better, right? And to do that with the humility of realizing that others are going to have different opinions from us, right? In terms of what better means, right? Because I like reading and writing, whereas Plato hates it, absolutely, right? It doesn't mean that Plato's an inferior human being to myself, but we need to have that humility but that's very difficult for a natural science, because it's in the pursuit of truth, right?
Mm.
And there's this fuzzy way of thinking that perhaps everyone values different things, that upsets natural scientists and engineers immensely. And I do feel sometimes like I'm betraying my roots when I speak like this, to say that, well, for certain things there are no truths, in experience. Yeah. But I think we can all agree that enabling is, well, in certain contexts, the right way to go forward.
I think
Yeah.
I think that's quite a powerful that's quite a powerful way to think about things as well. As a as a as a person myself who is also, what also is still to some extent very taken by the functional aspects of some aspects within psychology, to be
Mhm.
able to then say, but actually there are, the experiential element is incredibly important as well, whilst also using some of those concepts, or those things that are described in that science to be able to make better experiences, I think is an interesting one. I mean, for instance, in your talk, you mentioned, aspects of understanding things like kind of, change blindness or aspects of attention blindness whenever devising interfaces, or whenever you're using the eyes to control things, realizing how that functions to be able to make those better experiences. I think that, one of the things I wanted to ask you around those things is that, do we need to focus a lot more on how those processes operate to make those experiential, positive experiences? So do we have to, be aware that there's aspects of awareness that we need to be to think about, as well as, how attention works to be able to make those excellent experiences that we have? So there's almost like a marriage between that functional element of those sciences, as well as the element of
Mm,
making those experiences that are brilliant for people to have.
well, you know my background, right? So
Mm.
there's certain, I think the extent to which we're able to rely on the harder sciences, such as with eye tracking or neuroscience, is to say, well, there's certain explanations that simply don't work, right? It's very unlikely that I can read with, even if I can cast attention to peripheral vision, there is no way that I'm capable of reading with peripheral vision for certain text sizes, right? So the more specific you are with your stimulation, with your environment, the more likely you're going to have a hard scientific truth, right? I think we can almost certainly rule out telepathy or telekinesis based on what we understand of the brain, right? And physics, right? I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm saying it's highly implausible, right?
Yeah.
I think the hard sciences help that way, right? It allows us to focus on what's really important by ruling out certain processes.
Mm.
But I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think the mistake that we're making is to treat the space that it has offered us as a recipe for building stuff.
Yeah.
I think that might be the danger that we of treating the hard sciences. I think it's good in defining the design space. I don't think it ought to dictate the rules of that space per se.
I think I definitely agree with that. I think that's definitely one of the things that's quite useful whenever looking to hard sciences or looking to disciplines, to be able to kind of map that design space, to be able to almost mapping the playground that we have in a particular way. I suppose
Right.
one of the things I wanted to mention actually with because I'd like to bring in some questions from the audience here as well. But one of the last things I wanted to discuss is this idea that you brought in the talk around this kind of partner-partner relationship that you have with looking at, moving from customer server, moving from that kind of tool-oriented interaction. What do you think are the major scientific breakthroughs or innovations that are required to be able to make that a reality? Because one of the things that you talked about was this sense of moving from seeing the technology as a tool, and then maybe more as a kind of an extension of the self, or also having, that might have its own beliefs or its own actions, its own intentions. What are the things that we need to see in the future to make that partnership a reality?
I don't really know the answer to that because I think our experiences are going to be very different in terms of depending on the instantiation of technology.
Yeah.
Right? So as long as we're coming to a large extent closer to the physical world, so in terms of what the stimulation might be, what's being sensed, and what's being acted on, so as long as we come close to physics, the physical world, I think that's there's this large agreement between a technology, a piece of machinery, and a human, because we're all grounded in the physics of things, right? But what's tricky would be the bits inside the interpretation, the planning, and the deciding, especially for autonomous systems, right? In terms of us once again determining what an appropriate set of possible interpretations might be, what are worthwhile plans to pursue, what are ethical decisions to make. I think we'd be in agreement in terms of, did that machine sense something correctly, or did it act as, not in terms of act appropriately, but did it act the way it was supposed to, right? Okay, but everything in between, it's going to be a massive gray area, right? Now, what concerns me with so-called artificial intelligence is that there's going to be a set of interpretations, plans, and decision-making that's going to be largely based, because we're currently going with we're going with data. We're basing this on available data. The argument being, how wrong can we be if the data that we have, the digital data that we have, reflects how things are currently being done in the civilized world? Because this assumption means that there is truth, that there is a perfect way of interpreting something, a perfect way of planning something, and a perfect way of deciding something. And that perfect way might just be the grand average. It doesn't allow for diversity, different ways of interpreting, different ways of interpretation, right? It biases decision-making or thought processes to societies that provide the most information with regards to what ought to be documented as the proper right way of behaving or thinking about things, right? So that concerns me somewhat in terms of the direction in which we're currently headed with regards to artificial intelligence, of saying what's right is what's done most often.
I think I think I share your concerns there as well when it comes to
Mhm.
that. There's definitely that element of the space that's planning and kind of boiling down to the average is always a little bit a little of a worrying trend within that. So I think we've got a few questions here I want to bring in before
Right.
so we've got from the audience here, absolutely fascinating talk mentioning here an ideal world where technology evolves from our tools to partners. What revolution of user experience do you think will likely take place? Since some of the examples in the slides go beyond interaction on screens. So what kind of revolution do you think will take place then? And what areas of knowledge do you think practitioners should catch up on?
So I can't give a definitive answer to that, but I can tell you what some people are thinking of, which I disagree with. But Albrecht and his team. So my previous boss, right, just wrote a thought-provoking piece that suggested that large language models could replace the need for using actual humans in designing user interfaces. And he's approaching this once again from a very pragmatic perspective, saying that it's not pragmatic and even potentially unethical to use humans when computers could do the job much faster, right? Now, I'm taking a midway position. It's patricide is never a good idea. I'm taking a middle position. I half agree with him, especially with underrepresented communities. It's just not wise to have to rely entirely on individuals such as those with visual impairments, the elderly, to participate in experiments when it costs them so much to turn up for an experiment. One needs to pilot and one needs to think about the whole process in much greater detail before one actually does an experiment that uses human participants as resources, as standing reserves to get at knowledge, right? So but on the other hand, these are the communities that are underserved by large language models, right? Because their experiences, their representations of the world are not adequately or sufficiently captured by current data, right? So it's unlikely it's going to really work for them. So where I think we might go with what we can see of current technology is we might start to create diversity of computational representations of different users and different user personas, right? And what encourages me about this not just being a pipe dream is that companies certainly understand this principle to design their products and services to cater to very specific demographics than to everyone, right? The danger there might be that the commercial interest might start to rule out certain demographics as being worthwhile to develop computational representation or models for. So it ended up being a somewhat sociopolitical answer for which I'm not trained in, nor do I have the ability to do very much about. So practitioners could catch on in trying to represent such underserved demographics, but I'm not entirely certain where that motivation might come from, if not from a commercial interest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So the one final question here we got from so when designing technology, how do we balance users' needs for familiarity with innovation? So whether it may be to design technology as more than just a tool or to design for inclusive technology, what's that role of familiarity and how do we balance that with the elements of innovation? And actually, I had a similar question written down about metaphors, about that idea of, creating the familiar whilst also innovating with different forms. What are your views on those kind of areas?
This isn't based on my expertise, it's based on my personal experience. Identify your demographics and determine how much pain it would be for them to learn. Run a study that pinpoints the pain or the cost factors for learning, and weigh that against the benefits of what this new technology offers, beyond just novelty.
Thanks so much, Lewis, for the answers to those questions. Don't forget to review and follow us. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can by emailing us at humanandthemachinepodcast@gmail.com. All that's left for me to say is, as ever, I've been Ben Cowan. Stay curious and don't let the machines get you down. Until next time.